Sup, Evil? I'm Leon, the Paperback Maniac, coming at you with another vintage horror book review. Today, we are taking a look at Fright Night by John Skipp and Craig Spector, and based on an original screenplay by Tom Holland. Yes, this is the first over here at Paperback Mania. I'm finally reviewing a novelization. I own quite a few of these. Check out my novelization collection video if you haven't already. And this is definitely one of my most prized ones. I am a huge fan, first of all, of Fright Night, the film. I've seen it countless times. I've owned countless media editions. I've seen it in the theater. In fact, check out my, I think, Fangoria collection video in which I recount sort of an awkward encounter I had with the director of Fright Night, Tom Holland, at the concession stand. But yeah, love the film, and to have a novelization written by John Skipp and Craig Spector, no less, made me even more kind of curious about it. And funnily enough, actually, I was planning on reading another Skipp and Spector book this month, a much longer book, but decided against it at the last minute, and went with this one. So this book was published by Tor in August of 1985 to coincide with the release of the film, which came out on August 2nd, 1985. So I will go ahead and read the synopsis now from the back cover. Next Door Vampire. Charlie Brewster is a horror movie fan, a kid with an active imagination. So when he begins telling people that his new next-door neighbor is a vampire, no one believes him. Not the police, not his girlfriend Amy, not even the school weirdo Evil Ed. But Charlie's seen the coffin and the bodies drained of blood and knows he will be the vampire's next victim. Charlie's last chance is to enlist the help of Peter Vincent, vampire killer. But Vincent, star of 100 horror movies and host of TV's Fright Night, doesn't believe in vampires either. Until Evil Ed becomes one and tries to kill him. Until Amy disappears into the vampire's house. Until a has-been actor and a frightened teenager must face the greatest evil they have ever known. All right, so yeah, that does a pretty good job of summarizing the plot of this book for anyone out there who hasn't seen the movie, although I find it hard to believe anyone watching, this channel would not have seen Fright Night. Yeah, so as I said, I have always loved Fright Night, and to get a novelization written by John Skipp and Craig Spector is very, very appealing. Now, there are some really big novelization fans out there. I know there are people who collect novelizations almost exclusively, like in their libraries at home, and I think part of the big appeal of them is because novelizations are often sort of going off early drafts of a screenplay, and so they often kind of shed a little insight into sort of like the evolution of a film, and it can be kind of fun to read a novelization and kind of see like how much it differs in respects from the final product of a film. Now, this novelization is not wildly different, and I knew that actually going in. I had heard that it adhered pretty closely to the narrative of the film, and that's probably because it was written by the movie was written by its director, Tom Holland. This was his baby, his brainchild, and so he wasn't changing massive things in it. It actually does. It sticks pretty closely to the film. There are some small differences, which I'll touch on here in this review. But yeah, as far as the book itself, it is kind of like a singular vision of Tom Holland, and here in the novelization, it's kind of brought to life by Skipp and Spector in their sort of signature and inimitable style. Now, to give a little brief background on John Skipp and Craig Spector, they kind of burst onto the horror scene in 1986 with the release of their first kind of original collaboration, the New York City punk vampire novel, The Light at the End. And they have that, and that book is sort of like become the sort of signature novel, at least for me, when I think of splatterpunk. When I think of, this short sort of movement, I guess, isn't it, although it wasn't really a movement, but splatterpunk was a term coined by writer David Scow almost facetiously, and then it kind of stuck. But it's a term that existed briefly and I guess crops up every now and then now, although I feel like it's misused when it's used now, because I feel like people just misunderstand that term all the time, because splatterpunk is not just about the splatter, but it's about the punk. It's about subverting sort of tropes and sort of like taking what we think we know and kind of upending it a little bit. And it definitely is not just about like grossing the reader out and being as graphic as possible, although that is part of it. But it was also about kind of being iconoclastic and different and kind of like going against sort of like the grain of like traditional, I guess, like horror fiction. But so John Skipp actually was he was a guy that was kind of like this punk, I guess, in the 80s. He had a buddy named Craig Spector. They had been in some bands, and Skipp was publishing short stories in Ted Klein's Twilight Zone magazine, and really, like just wanting to be a writer. And I guess Craig Spector, who was not a writer, was just filled with all kinds of ideas. And actually, it was his idea. He had an idea for I guess he thought it was a short story at first, about a punk living in the sewers of New York City. And he was really excited, and he told Skipp about this, and they started developing it, and they quickly realized it wasn't a short story but a novel. And they only had one typewriter, so it was really John Skipp doing the writing, with Craig Spector kind of just like having all these crazy and wild ideas. And that's that's a great book. It's not like an excellent book. Definitely is flawed, but is really interesting for anyone interested in this era of horror fiction. But apparently, so they had been working on that, and I guess racking up rejection letters. But then somehow they got the job to do the novelization for Fright Night, and apparently they were given a 1-month deadline to do it. And so they kind of, I guess, like did divide and conquer. And John Skipp in interviews has said that because Craig Spector wasn't very practiced in writing at that stage, Skipp had to like go back and like pretty much rewrite most of the stuff that Craig Spector had written. But they got it done in a month, I guess, like for the release of the movie. But that's pretty impressive that they were able to hammer this out in a month, because it is pretty well written. It's pretty well done. John Skipp, I've always thought, was a pretty cool, like stylistic writer. But so as I said before, the novel, for the most part, plays out like the film. I'm not going to recount the whole thing. I mean, I'm imagining most of you guys know Fright Night, and the summary, does a pretty good job. But there are some small differences. So like we learn a little bit more about Evil Ed in the book. We kind of learn about like how he has this really unhappy home life, how his parents are like just worried about their son, and like why is he like so alienated and so strange. Like he definitely comes across more as like a freak in the book, even though he's pretty weird in the movie too, but more of like a horror freak too. And he's got like this awesomely described bedroom with like when he hangs out in his bedroom, he's like painting like monster models that he orders from like famous monsters of filmland, and he's got posters of like Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. and Lugosi on his walls. His bedroom shelves are lined with like old horror paperbacks and like copies of like Tales from the Crypt and eerie horror comics and all that stuff. So you definitely get more of a sense of Evil Ed being sort of like this horror outcast weirdo in the book. It makes it more clear in that sense. In the book, there's also a lot more tension between Evil Ed and Charlie Brewster. So, here they've been friends since 7th grade, and Evil Ed is like actually really pissed at Charlie because ever since he's been seeing his new girlfriend Amy, he's been ditching him for like the last 3 months. And so he's like super salty, and there's almost like a lot of like rancor like between them. And when Charlie goes to Evil Ed actually to say like, hey, I think, you know, my neighbor's a vampire. Evil Ed basically like tells him to like screw off. Like he says like, fuck off. You like, you never have time for me anymore. So that, you know, is a little different. We also learn a little more about the vampire killer, Peter Vincent, or Herbert McHoulihy, which is his real name, we find out in the book. In this, yeah, we learn a little more. It's alluded to in the movie very, very laconically that he's like struggling. Like in the movie, all you do is you see like, I think like an eviction notice quickly. But in the book, I mean, in the book, he's, you know, he's like, yeah, he's definitely struggling like with his job. His career's in the dumps. He's like, it's hard for him to pay the rent. And, you know, he ends up only helping Charlie when, you know, Charlie's girlfriend Amy shows up at his place, not with Evil Ed, as in the movie, but just alone, because, you know, Evil Ed is like super salty. But, you know, he decides to help Charlie, not out of the goodness of his own heart, of course, but just because she offers him, you know, that $500, which Peter Vincent could really use to pay the rent. So, you know, definitely kind of shows a little more of the dire straits that Peter Vincent is in. As far as the vampire, Jerry Dandridge, he doesn't come off quite as like suave and sexy as he does in the movie. He's definitely a little more menacing, I would say, and predatory in the book. And like, you know, certain subplots are missing from this draft or the book that was based on like an early draft of the movie, such as there's nothing about like Amy basically being like the doppelganger of like Jerry Dandridge's like wife from like centuries ago. That's all gone. Yeah, in the book we also get a little more description of the suburban town where Charlie Brewster lives, which apparently is called Rancho Corvallis, and it's cool. There's a Romero Drive. There's another street called Wicker Man, which is kind of cute. And the high school that Charlie Brewster and Evil Ed go to is Christopher L. Cushing High, which is cool, which obviously are a reference to Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, right? Two horror icons. But yeah, you know, there are other like small changes here and there. Like at the nightclub that they go to, like the music is a little different. In the book, it's Michael Jackson's Thriller, which I imagine, you know, Tom Holland wrote into like early drafts of the screenplay before he realized that like he couldn't afford Michael Jackson's Thriller because that was like the biggest song of all time, you know, at that time for sure. But yeah, I do like how in I guess in the movie as well to a subtler extent, and definitely in the book, Tom Holland, the writer, you know, the creator of this, makes a dig at the then current trend of like super violent slasher movies. In fact, he has Peter Vincent complain to Charlie Brewster that the young generation doesn't care about vampires anymore, and that all they want to see is, quote, demented madmen running around in ski masks, hacking up nubile young virgins, end quote. Yes, because that, you know, at the time of the release, 1985, I mean, the early 80s, super gory slashers were all the rage, and you know, the classic horror tropes like vampires were sort of considered old hat and passé. And, you know, many believe that it was actually Fright Night that sort of reinvigorated and kind of brought back sort of like more classic horror villains. And, you know, after this film, definitely more vampire movies came out, more vampire comedies even, such as like Vamp and so on. But, yeah, overall, this book was really entertaining. It's super fast read. I mean, the pages just flew by. It was well written, as I mentioned before, which definitely like helped out. You know, and I think you could easily read this thing in like a day or so. Yeah, I definitely did enjoy it, and it makes me actually really kind of eager and curious about the sequel to Fright Night, which Tom Holland wrote a couple of years ago, apparently. And in fact, there's even an Amazon listing still for it, although it just says like unknown or unavailable. But it was called Fright Night Resurrection, and it was a sequel, to Fright Night, a novel that Tom Holland, the writer and director of the film, wrote. And he talked about it when I saw the film in the theater. like a couple of years ago. But yeah, I don't know. It's still not available on Amazon. If anyone knows about that, let me know because I would love to read that. I'd love to read like his take on the the sequel to Fright Night. What happens with Charlie Brewster and Jerry Dandridge and all that. But yeah, this was super fun, and I would like to read more novelizations. There are some that I'm like, definitely like eagerly awaiting. Like I definitely want to read John Russo's Return of the Living Dead novelization, which is kind of funny because that's a novelization based on like a novel that he wrote. But I also want to read like Matthew J. Costello's Child's Play novelizations, Ray Garton's Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5 novelizations, also his Warlock novelization. Yeah, there are a lot out there. If you guys have any suggestions of novelizations, that you've read and loved and would like to see me review, definitely drop a comment below and let me know because yeah, these are fun. They're fun, fast reads. Obviously, like it's not going to be like it's different from reading a novel because you do know like what's coming. So narratively, there's not a whole lot of surprises. But the ones that are written by solid writers like Skipp and Spector or like a Matthew J. Costello or a Ray Garton, I think would be fun times to read. So yeah, guys, that's Fright Night. That book is actually, even though this copy, the original paperback, is fairly obscure and kind of goes for higher prices online, it has been reissued. There's a Kindle edition, so you guys can definitely check it out. And yeah, you could just like spend a night reading it. It's super fun and super fast read. So check it out. Easily accessible these days. Fright Night. There you go. Thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate it. Till next time, take it easy. Peace out.